one of the first questions that comes up for me is, why should we have a chemistry of bliss? What does that do for us? And I would say that it's an evolutionary adaptation. It helps us to work together, to cooperate, and to move in a space of mutual experience and meaning. So I would say that humans who could sing, or humans who developed singing and drumming and dancing practices, engaged one another in a meaningful way that allowed people to work together culturally. Anything that increases your sense of compassion or your sense of sensitivity to other people is valuable. If you look at a world in which it's entirely competitive and sort of dog eat dog, if everybody's constantly competing against one another, it's hard to get anything done. In order to build a society, we have to have mechanisms that help us to cooperate. It's an interesting thing that during the pandemic, when people could not get together and engage in practices that brought about a sense of mutual joy, we started to see people essentially screaming at one another on social media, and things fell apart. So we need these practices in order to, in some ways, counteract some of our worst instincts and to invest us in some of the better angels of our nature. What's the neurochemistry of ecstasy? I mean, it's fascinating that our brains are full of fantastic chemistry that our brains actually are built to create. There are no drugs that you can take from externally. There's no drugs that you can take from the outside that don't have some kind of mechanism in which they fit inside. So we're in some ways built for bliss. We're full of fantastic chemicals like dopamine, which causes us to seek rewards, anandamide, which is itself a bliss-producing chemical that helps to, in some ways, unlock the connections in our brain that we usually maintain and allow a different process of ideation. So if you think about this, if your brain is locked up in all of these patterns, one thing that opens up creative thought is the relinquishment of those patterns. So you have to almost disconnect all those dots in order to connect them in another way. So this chemistry allows us in some ways to think differently and in some ways reformat our brains. One of the things that chanting also produces is a massive dose of oxytocin, which is a chemical that, for example, both a mother and an infant's brains are flooded with just after birth. It causes bonding, and it causes a feeling like a wave of compassion and connection. So for us to exist as humans culturally, we have to keep engaging in these practices. Otherwise, we lose our sense of compassion and connection to one another, and a kind of anarchy results. And that may be a kind of default condition that humans are in. But the reason why we engage in some of these practices, call them yogic practices, but they're not specifically confined to yoga. I mean, singing in a choir can do the same thing for you. Dancing together in all kinds of, circumstances, from, pagan to Sufi or whatever, all create the same experience. So it seems like a lot of cultures are aiming at the same point, possibly from different directions. But what we have in common is that our brains are built for bliss, and that makes us more successful humans. It makes our species more successful because it allows us to cooperate.